Hi, everyone. I think we're going to get started for our last LEAP lecture of the year. Starting off, we have Joseph Lockwood. Joe graduated with a PhD in geosciences with a minor in computational science and engineering from Princeton University in May 2024. As an applied scientist, Dr. Lockwood's research centers on generative AI, super resolution, explainable AI, extreme weather, and energy modeling. He has published scientific articles on machine learning, weather, energy, and decarbonization and economics. Without further ado, welcome, Joe.
Thank you. Everyone can hear me okay? Yep. Okay. Yeah, so today, my understanding of this is that I need to give like a research update. So I thought I would focus on two projects that I've been working on since joining Columbia. One is slightly more formed. So I actually published it a few weeks ago in the Journal of Geophysical Research, Machine Learning and Computing. And I'll talk briefly about this paper. Interested in carrying on expanding it, but it was looking at applying generative machine learning, in particular diffusion models for tropical cyclone wind fields in climate and weather data. So I'll talk briefly about that today. And the next, these are kind of less well-formed projects, a little bit outside of my prior wheelhouse from my PhD, but the main one I'll be focusing on is looking at like essentially more explainable AI for essentially like exploring features controlling, in particular, convective cloud regimes, so using a deep learning framework. Also have another project looking at super resolution for oceanic turbulence, but I won't talk about that today. So yeah, just to motivate the first projects I'll be discussing. So for those of you that don't know, there's a real challenge in hurricane modeling, particularly forecasting and modeling tropical cyclones, otherwise known as hurricanes, in the North Atlantic. So this is due to a variety of different reasons. One of them being the short duration deviations from the kind of mean or average atmospheric state. They're very, very short or high frequency, very high intensity events. So many numerical weather prediction models often struggle to capture these very intricate inner core dynamics, the physics of these events. So we can see the physics it's often not captured in very coarse resolution climate models and weather data. So we can think of CMIP data, era 5 reanalysis. We can think of like Pangu or GraphCast for AI deep learning weather models. They all kind of struggle to capture these events. Hopefully shouldn't have to motivate why we're interested in capturing them. Everything from energy modeling to insurance, like evacuation measures. We really need to understand these events to be modeling them correctly. So that's kind of the motivation. As I mentioned, many of the climate and weather models, the spatial resolution of these models is generally around 0.25 degrees horizontal resolution, all the way up to one degree. So the CMIP climate models, the kind of the revolution in AI weather models, they're around 1 degree resolution, many of them. So this leads to a kind of systematic underrepresentation of the intensity, especially for the really extreme events. So you can think Cat 4, 5, many of the reanalysis, the climate projections really don't get anywhere near that. So we can kind of see this here. I know it's a small figure, but this is the sea level pressure versus wind speed. The red is kind of our best estimate, is from something called IB-Trax. And this era 5 is, the reanalysis for the same events. We can see how, for the really extreme events, the era 5 reanalysis was used really, really widely, just doesn't get anywhere near this. And also the spatial resolution kind of leads to very unrealistic structural representations of the particularly wind fields, but also precipitation and yeah. The motivation of this paper was to think about applying super resolution techniques, in particular to both increase the spatial resolution of these events, particularly the wind field, but also try and kind of correct the intensity. So can we use generative machine learning to improve the wind fields that we can then maybe apply to CMIP6 models, to the deep learning weather models. And obviously, super resolution comes from computer vision and is starting to be used quite widely, in climate and weather, from transformers, GANs, and more recently, diffusion models. So this paper was looking at an application of a type of diffusion model, DDPM, a denoising diffusion probabilistic model. Both to try and improve the spatial resolution, but also the intensity of these events, given the low resolution data set as input. So can we correct both the intensity and the resolution? Maybe this will be very, very valued, particularly with the limitations around the physical numerical weather prediction models at the moment. Simulating them at a high enough resolution is really, really challenging, particularly for like ensemble generations. So the framework, I know this is a bit of a busy figure, but essentially the main takeaway is that the input to this model, I'm using the ERA5 reanalysis I mentioned earlier, the pressure, the V, U and V components, the spatial gradients, and also landmasks. And the first step was essentially a debiasing or denoising neural network to try and improve the intensity in particular of the wind fields. And then the second step was a super resolution. So in particular, taking the 25 or the 0.25 degree horizontal resolution and super resolving it down to 0.05 or around 6 kilometers. And essentially the target, obviously there's an issue with how are we training the model, and the target we're using in particular very, very high resolution satellite imagery as the target for our data set. So we're mapping from the ERA5 data to the high resolution satellite wind fields that's called H-wind. It's quite common in insurance. And that's kind of our target, our truth otherwise, for the same events, for the same time steps. Hopefully that will make sense. Again, we're using the ERA5 at 0.25 and then mapping to the H-wind database, increasing the resolution from 0.25 to 0.05. So using first the kind of debiasing neural network to help improve the intensity before we super resolve using a conditional diffusion probabilistic model. So one of the benefits of this model is probabilistic, so it can give an ensemble very quickly once trained. So moving on to some results. So just looking at the kind of intensity correction, both of the neural network, but also the super resolution. So we have the test modeled values, but then the H-wind. So this is the truth. The red is the ERA5. So we can really see how, and this is a QQ plot. We can see how the ERA5 compared to the truth is very, very it's really poor extreme events. It's really underestimating these extremes. The blue is our model. So the neural network and diffusion model, we can really see how this model is able to correct, particularly the very high intensity events. So this was really promising. Improved all of the metrics like correlation, mean square error, mean square error, did some of the statistical tests, and it really validated the model robustness. So so the first step was very very encouraging. So this was the kind of first step of improving the intensity. Second is also improving the spatial resolution of the model. So this down the bottom here is different events. So we have Andrea, Hurricane Bill, Hurricane Sandy, some different time steps. The very bottom is the input data, so the era 5 input data, wind fields, and then the middle is our diffusion model. The top is the target, so what we were trying to map to. And the diffusion model is just one ensemble from, in the paper, I was producing like 40 ensembles for each time step and event. So we can see the diffusion model really improves can't really see the resolution, but improves both the resolution and the intensity. So this was also really promising. And yeah, we also did some tests. So particularly for like insurance modeling, we're really interested in, and also like storm surge, hurricane inundation modeling. We need also information around about the structural or radial profiles of hurricanes, particularly the wind field and surface pressure. So we also had to look at some different tests and also use some explainable AI to see the really important features that were both improving the intensity. And essentially what we found is that surface pressure was, so this is like an importance metric based on like the sum of the integrated gradients in the neural network. So you see surface pressure, also U-wind, but then we also, quite surprisingly, the gradients of the wind were very important in improving the intensity and resolution of the data. We can also see the radial profiles of the hurricanes. So the left is Cat 1 and 2, so the low intensity events. The right is Cat 3, 4, 5, the more high intensity events. The green is the era 5, so the input data. The blue is the target. The orange is the output of our models, so both the mean and the ensemble range. And again, really, I think great progress with this method and this framework. So really capturing the radial profiles and in particular from the very laggy. So this is the eye wall here is 0, and then the radius of maximum wind, this peak here, which is a really difficult thing to model. But we can see by both improving the spatial resolution intensity, we're able to map and correct the era 5 data. Also interested in like the evolution of this model over time. So this is some time series. Again, the green is the era 5. The blue is what we're trying to model to for also the test data. And in particular, this is showing very, again, really promising results, surprisingly good results with the diffusion model, and is able to produce like an ensemble as well. And things like intensification and de-intensification. So these very sharp changes in the model. Conscious of time, but yeah, this is a conclusion of the first paper. So we developed a neural network debiasing and diffusion model framework for super resolving high intensity, particularly high intensity tropical cyclone winds using low resolution inputs. We're able to capture both the resolution and the accuracy fine scale wind structures, which might be really impactful for correcting reanalysis and also climate and weather models. There are some key challenges. So as with many machine learning models, there is non-stationarity in maybe concerns around non-stationarity of the data, particularly if we input data out of the distribution. For example, using like data from a different climate or under climate change, particularly due to shifts in the mean state and also variability. Although I've been considering using physics-informed neural networks, showing some promise, particularly in geophysical flows, to kind of constrain that out of sample testing. Yeah, so this is the first paper. No, I'm rushing through this a bit quickly, but yeah, moving on to the next projects I'll be talking about today, which is the exploration of the features controlling. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, for the first paper, is that applicable for forecasts? Can your work be taken and
Yeah.
related?
For sure. I don't see why we can apply it to any of the weather forecasting models. They're the similar spatial resolution, and all the variables are exactly the same. Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So, following on that, like, did you test the generalization out to new storms that you didn't train with? Or is this really just something that if you have all the pieces, you can?
Yeah, so what we did was split the events. We had around 100 events. We split them into a test and train, and we split the events. So there was no like.
That would suggest that you could use it operationally.
Yeah.
Do you, and what, are you only getting surface winds here? Or are you getting the full structure of the cyclone and precipitation and other things? Or is it really just about the wind field, or is it feedback basically to the other components of the system?
Yeah, so just for this, we were just looking at the wind fields. So just trying to correct specifically wind fields. There was another paper there, this paper here that was using a PINN for the 3D structure of winds. So I mean, that would definitely be a really good addition. But yeah, the purpose really was just to improve the spatial resolution and intensity of the data that already existed.
So if it wasn't an operational system, you might be able to tell people what the winds are going to be, but you wouldn't improve the precipitation forecast, for example.
Yeah, I mean, it could
maybe just more work to do that.
I mean, it's equally applicable to precipitation as well.
So you think you could do it in a coupled sense, both of them, but it's just.
Sure, I think I would probably have to include other variables like, specific humidity or some kind of structure from the atmosphere. But I don't see why not. Yeah. Yeah, so the next project, this is really a work in progress, but essentially the idea of this was to look at the representation of deep convection and some of the factors controlling deep convection. So obviously this has been a really a decades-long challenge, limiting things like long-range forecasts and one of the key uncertainties in climate models. So there are a few different approaches. The reductionists focus on, the elements, so the underlying physics, so the plumes or thermals or cold pools, and another kind of approach that is more empirical. A few of them in particular. So much of the motivation for this paper is coming from a paper by Raymond, 2021. So essentially looking at producing some metrics to explain convective regimes in the atmosphere. So focusing on different metrics like I'll talk more about in a minute, but saturation fraction may ring some bells, or instability index. Obviously, many people know about CAPE, sea surface temperature, and most of this is derived from, or my understanding, this is not my primary field, I'm still learning, but around gross moist stability, which is a function of entropy divergence, but also moist convergence. So as I mentioned, a number of studies have looked at predictors for strong convection. So obviously many people know about CAPE, and there are another few metrics, so introduced in mainly Raymond's papers, but the saturation fraction, and the other one is the deep convective inhibition and the instability metric on the far right. But as you can see, many of them are, or what has been shown, that the fraction of the variance of this kind of convection is pretty low, and also there's some uncertainty around the different ranges they use to calculate. So, for example, they kind of a little bit arbitrarily pick out different levels to calculate these metrics. The idea was that maybe we could use Explainable AI to identify important controls of convection, particularly focusing on the vertical integrated moisture convergence and hence mean rainfall during convection. So the idea of this project is to use Explainable AI to first identify the different levels. So use in particular VAE to first non-dimensionalize the profiles of things like saturation, moist or saturated moist static energy or moist static energy in the atmosphere, potential temperature, and then identify the important levels using Explainable AI, then maybe use those levels through symbolic regression to produce a physical equation that maybe will be explaining convection better than these metrics. So to talk about this a little bit more, or the direction I'll be moving in is essentially looking at inputting from era 5 data, profiles of moist static energy, saturated moist static energy, potential temperature and mixing ratio, just at regions that have been identified to have convective cloud regimes. So this is a way to like identify, and we have a year of data, identify, or input the profiles into, in particular, VAE model. So this is a way of like non-dimensionalizing all these profiles, and then we can use Explainable AI on those profiles to kind of understand the really important levels, to see if there are important levels that are being identified by the VAE. And then once we have those important levels, the idea is that we're using symbolic regression on those identified levels to kind of produce physical equations that may be more like that we can then interpret to like look at convective regimes. So the output of it would be the analytical expressions to describe, in our case, vertically integrated moisture convergence. So the key, one of the key controllers of convective regimes in the atmosphere. So, for example, we might get an interpretable physical equation as the output. And the idea is that we're not really choosing any of the levels that maybe we think might be important in the atmosphere. We're using a purely ML framework. So it looks quite messy, but this is the important metrics by altitude or the pressure levels in the atmosphere. So this is the surface all the way up, and this is the different profiles. So we have moist entropy, we have moist saturated entropy, potential temperature, and mixing ratio. So essentially, if there is a high value, it would suggest that this is a very important level identified in the VAE and then the sharp values. And essentially, all the different lines are different structures of the VAE. So we would suggest that if many different structures of a VAE all identify the same level, maybe it's a really important level. That makes sense. So we're looping over different latent dimensions from 2 all the way up to 30, and also the beta value in the beta VAE. So the idea would be that, if many levels are being identified as important across all these different spatial dimensions, it might be really important. And this is kind of summary figure over all of these different dimensions. And we can see that many of the VAE models are converging on some, or placing maximum importance on some different levels. So in particular, the surface potential temperature, the 400 hectopascal mixing ratio, for example. And then essentially what we can do from this now is take all of that, we can identify these levels. I'm kind of summarizing, we do much finer resolution of the profiles, but we can then pick out these important levels as potentially, we can now put them into a symbolic regression. So we have these inputs, these important levels we've identified. So for example, the surface potential temperature, as I mentioned. And what we're doing then is putting all of that information over the full year for the different profiles, convective profiles, into a package, PISA. So essentially, it's a symbolic regression package that uses the different functions and searches the space to produce analytical expressions. So as I mentioned, we have an analytical output that maybe we would think might be, better, or just as, or we would hope would be better than the other metrics like CAPE or saturation fraction. So still working on this, but the best equation I've kind of found so far is it's kind of ugly, as many of them are. So this bottom one here, and what I'm doing at the moment is then comparing the equations that we're producing to these metrics. So how does it fare versus CAPE and I'm doing this by comparing to the explained fraction of variance compared to the integrated moist. What was it? As the fraction of variance explained in moisture convergence. So, and this is what we have at the bottom. So the very bottom is our equation, and then we have saturation fraction, CAPE, this deep convection inhibition metric. And what we did find is that particularly the explained variance is actually, I know it's all very, very low. This is widely seen in many papers, but it actually seems to be improving the explained variance, particularly for this integrated moisture convergence. It's a little bit uninterpretable right now. Needs to kind of dive a little bit deeper into it. But I think there's promising results here. And also we can look at like mean convective rainfall, how much variance the symbolic regression equations produce. And yeah, also the fact that there's quite a lot of, or a very small variance explains, kind of suggests that there's maybe other environmental or independent processes that may be acting. So maybe I could include some more variables in there to try and increase this. And I know that was very quick and not very well formed, but just to conclude, so as many different papers have looked at, try to produce these models to kind of predict or to explain some convective regimes in the atmosphere, integrated moisture convergence, and also rainfall. And by their definitions, often rely on relatively arbitrary vertical levels. So they're just choosing different levels, relatively arbitrary. We try to kind of circumvent this by using a VAE for the for the kind of trying to reduce some of this data, particularly for convective regimes, and then analyze the latent space and identify the important levels independent of any any human judgment. And then once we have these levels, we could then input them into a symbolic regression to get a physically, it's not interpretable right now, but hopefully a physically interpretable equation. Yeah, and I think this is a really actually interesting framework that could potentially be applied to different kind of climate problems. So often in ML, these models are really uninterpretable, and potentially we could use a similar kind of framework, use a VAE, and then try and produce a physically meaningful model equation that we can interpret physically, maybe gain some understanding of what the machine learning model might be learning. And yeah, I think that's about it for me. I'm not going to go any further, but yeah. Okay.
So it seems like in the last, really interesting work, it seems like you use the VAE sort of to reduce the level of complexity, I guess. And then the SHAP to sort of point you towards the levels that are most important. And then the the XAI to sort of then come up with a new equation, right? But
Yeah.
even in that last step, you seem to be throwing away some of the SHAP identified levels, right?
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
put in 6 or 7, and you ended up with 3 at the end, right?
Yeah.
So like basically it seems like there's
Yeah.
potential for a lot of loss of information between all these levels of reduction, right?
Yeah.
Is there some way to go without, why do you have to do this, I guess? Because it feels like maybe there's critical information that's been lost at some point in this step, and I'm not able to say what that would be. Because I don't know this area of science very well, but I mean, it's interesting
Mhm.
way of trying to reduce the information to something useful, but then the symbolic regression is sort of maybe trying to go back to get all the information again, and that might be why you don't get such a high level of variation explained.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. And I think, I mean, many of these metrics have hugely reduced information. So I think, I mean, this is not my field, like atmospheric convection. I'll be honest, I'm still learning. And I'm sure there's people that could speak to this better, but it's a hugely complicated problem. And I think one of the ways to make it more tractable is to produce these metrics, to simplify the system, identify different layers, different levels, different variables. But maybe, I mean, I could include more, or at least force the symbolic regression to keep those variables in there. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I guess that's right. Like,
Yeah.
how much could you add complexity back in order to let your symbolic regression get you further in the end, I guess?
Yeah.
Versus you're limited by
Mhm.
available data, limited by computer. I'm
Yeah.
not sure, but it seems like, yeah.
There's a lot of information being lost. I totally agree. Yeah, I mean, one of the steps in the symbolic regression is it identifies the variables that it seems to put importance on, just minimizing loss. So in that way, we'd hope it would be similar to the VAE, also identifying the important levels. We're kind of just leaving it to the models and trying to produce something that is interpretable, that is not, just kind of relatively arbitrary choices. But I'm hoping to boost that variance. But yeah.
Oh, hold on, Meg.
Thanks for the talk, Joe. My question is about interpreting the symbolic regression.
Yeah.
I'm curious, is that something that you are doing throughout the training process, or is it as you're trying to boost the predictability of your equation, focus on that, and at a certain point then you say, this is my equation, I'm going to interpret it.
Yeah.
And in particular, it seems like these equations, even if they're relatively simple, might still be hard to interpret.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a great point. And that's one of the problems with symbolic regression, unless it's a very simple, equation, it can spit out something that is equally uninterpretable. And I think that's one of the problems with this approach. And I do need to dive a bit deeper into the output. How much is it, explaining some of the variance? How much information is it providing? Does that answer your question? Yeah.
It does. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Joe.